The tide of the war in Ukraine has changed dramatically over just the past month or so, or at least the perception of the tide of the war in Ukraine has changed dramatically, even if Ukraine is actually just continuing to do what it has done for years now. But now Ukraine has had a couple of big wins, and people who haven't been paying much attention are starting to notice how good Ukraine actually is. And there is a growing consensus that Ukraine actually has the momentum, and that Russia cannot actually win this war. This is not just coming from Ukrainian propaganda or pro-Ukrainian YouTubers like myself, but is increasingly coming from some surprising places. Even the Trump administration, which famously told President Zelensky of Ukraine last year that he did not have any cards, and that if he didn't come to peace terms with Russia, his country would be totally destroyed, has now changed their tune, at least for this week. Maybe they'll change their minds again next week. And they're now saying that actually Ukraine is doing a good job and what they're doing is quite impressive, which are rather big statements, again, considering where they came from. But even more surprising than the United States, there is another country, or at least another country's leader, who seems to be flip-flopping. And that is the country of Belarus, or more specifically, the dictator Lukashenko. Lukashenko has been acting erratically over the past month or so. And it seems very odd, a lot of the actions that he's been taking. In fact, a lot of people are having trouble putting all the pieces together, myself included, although things are increasingly going in a particular direction. You see, Lukashenko doesn't seem to know how to handle the fact that it seems pretty clear that Russia is actually going to lose the war. And he's been doing a lot of things that now appear to be hedging bets, trying to build relationships with the outside world in order to protect his own country if Russia does fall. Lukashenko, of course, and the country of Belarus are one of the closest allies of Russia, and a lot of people consider Belarus to really just be an extension of Russia. But over the past couple of weeks, we've seen some very surprising things. Lukashenko actually, in front of international foreign media, foreign to him, he actually admitted that Russia could not win the war militarily. Now, he also said the same thing about Ukraine, but this in and of itself was a big leap. From a man who allowed Russia to invade Ukraine from his territory, and who for years has maintained that Russia will still eventually win this war. He has now admitted that Russia cannot militarily defeat Ukraine, but he's actually gone even further. He actually admitted recently, and I made a video about this, that Belarus, with Russian forces, could not defend itself against a potential Ukrainian attack, saying that if Belarus were to enter the war with Ukraine, Belarus would lose. And this is a big statement. This is not just a statement about the inability of Russian forces to take significantly more Ukrainian territory, although it is, but it actually goes much further than that. It's also a statement about Russian forces' inability to defend territory, the territory of Belarus, if a new front were to open. And implicitly, that is therefore a statement about Ukraine's ability to actually be successful in taking territory if they were to start a new offensive. Lukashenko is not convinced that the military of Belarus, combined with the military of Russia, could withstand the might of Ukraine. And that is a stunning admission and a potentially very large reversal. Now, what do we make of these statements is rather complicated. But at the very least, what it shows is that there is a very complex situation playing out in the mind of Lukashenko right now. And Ukraine recently provoked that complexity and took advantage of it by putting Lukashenko in a dilemma where he was forced to choose sides. That dilemma was this. Belarus has relay stations on their territory that are used by the Russians to attack Ukrainian cities on a regular basis. Their drones use these relay stations to establish connections, and it's one of the only ways they can get their large waves of drones to Ukrainian cities. Zelensky told Belarus that they now had 7 days to turn off those relay stations, forcing Belarus, Lukashenko in particular, to choose whether he wanted to appease the Russians or appease the Ukrainians, and thereby reveal who he was actually more afraid of. He chose to appease the Ukrainians, because as of this morning, these relay stations have stopped working. Now, whether they have actually been completely torn down is asked, that remains to be seen. But it is certainly a concession And even if Lukashenko changes his mind after some additional pressure, we will see what happens. It's pretty clear that his initial move was to appease Ukraine, revealing that he is actually afraid of them. This is a very, very big development, but it's not the only development in Belarus right now. Belarus is also rapidly remilitarizing, which at first might seem like a contradiction to what we just said. Belarus seems to be getting more and more aggressive. So what are we to make of that, now that we have more pieces to this puzzle with Lukashenko's recent actions? That's what I want to talk about in today's video, right after today's sponsor. You know, I read a lot of comments on this channel, and some of them stick with me. And recently, I've seen more people sharing their concerns about the long-term future of the United States. There's a theme. People have been watching all of this for years. The national debt, the growing deficit, and the money printing. But they don't actually know what they can do about it. There's a lot of people who see what's happening. Most people don't lack information. The challenge is that it's always easy to convince yourself that there's still more time. More time to research, more time to decide, more time to act. Until suddenly, a few years have gone by, and still nothing has changed. Right now, many people are starting to take a closer look at physical gold. Some people are purchasing it directly. Others are moving a portion of an IRA or 401k into a gold IRA. And that's one of the reasons I've partnered with Augusta Precious Metals, the sponsor of today's video. Augusta can help you figure out if a gold IRA is the right move for you. And what I like about Augusta is that they focus on education. They walk you through how everything works, answer your questions, and help you determine if it makes sense for your situation. With no pressure, just information. So if you want to learn more about what it looks like to purchase physical gold in a gold IRA, you can go to paullovesgold.com or text Paul to 35052 to get Augusta's helpful guide. Again, just go to paullovesgold.com or text Paul to 35052 to get Augusta's helpful guide. They'll walk you through everything, answer your questions, and then you can decide if it makes sense for you. So now I want to talk about Belarus's increasing military buildup and what we make of that. And I want to preface this discussion with this. From a strategic standpoint, Ukraine of course has to take this seriously. Any threat from Belarus has to be taken seriously because Belarus has threatened Ukraine so much, and Belarus has actually allowed Russian forces to attack Ukraine from their territory. Belarus is clearly a country who is willing to kick Ukraine while they're down. And so Ukraine has to be wise and smart and not ignore any threats. That's the preface, and Ukraine will do exactly that. That being said, I don't think that Ukraine actually has to worry about Belarus attacking them anytime soon. And I think there is a much better interpretation of Lukashenko's current military buildup. And it comes from this simple understanding about our world. When it comes to dictatorships, wherever they are across the globe, when they militarize, far more often than not, those militaries are intended to protect their regime and their internal power than they are to actually project power abroad. That is particularly the case of smaller dictatorships like Belarus. There are, of course, examples in the opposite direction. We have Vladimir Putin today. We have the various dictators involved in World War II. But those were all much more powerful countries. Belarus is more like a little fiefdom, a little kingdom who actually needs bigger allies in order to survive. Belarus historically has felt rather comfortable with a relatively small military. It's actually quite large for the size of the country it is when you compare it to other countries its size, but when you compare it, for example, to other countries that Belarus would potentially wage war against, Belarus's military is literally just a drop in the bucket. Belarus has been comfortable with a smaller military because they have been unified with Russia, and they have viewed Russia's military largely as their own military. In fact, from a lot of standpoints, the two militaries are integrated. The Russian military has training camps on Belarus's territory. The Russian military has nuclear missiles in Belarus's territory. Things of that sort. So when Belarus starts building up its own military, the leader Lukashenko starts building up his own military, our first thought should not be who is Belarus preparing to invade, but rather who is Lukashenko actually afraid of, potentially threatening his power? And when you look at things from that perspective, which again, far more often in history than not, that is the perspective that's accurate of dictators, we see a very interesting picture here. A picture that's actually consistent with everything else we've seen from Belarus, rather than seeming to work against it. A picture of a Belarus that understands that Russia is about to lose their war, and a picture of a dictator who wants to do everything he possibly can to increase his power base within his own country so that he doesn't become the next domino to fall. This is very important. Lukashenko is not in power because his people love him. Lukashenko is in power because after he lost his last election, Russia sent in special military police, three-letter agencies, to help quell protests in Belarus so that Lukashenko could retain his position, as they sent the leader who actually won the election into exile in Europe. Lukashenko made himself dependent on Russia for his own power. And now that Russia may fall, he has to be genuinely worried not about any outside countries, not actually about Ukraine, but about his own people. Now, while this can't be proven yet, there is a lot more to support this thesis than there is to disprove it, and that's important in and of itself. Because I don't actually hear this thesis being discussed really anywhere. It seems that every outlet is picking up on the same narrative, the dramatic one, the one that Belarus is about to attack Ukraine. And as I said, you can't ignore that narrative. That would be reckless. But at the same time, there's just so much arguing against this. We've already stated how Belarus itself, Lukashenko himself, has made statements that Belarus cannot win a war against Ukraine. And that is a very stark statement that is the exact opposite of a statement we would expect from a dictator who is preparing his country for war. We've seen examples, for example, in Vladimir Putin. It's the exact opposite. No matter how much Russia gets crushed, he tells people to disbelieve their own eyes and remember how powerful Russia is. In fact, Russia is not just fighting against Ukraine. They're fighting against the collective West, the entire outside world. And look how strong Russia still is despite these pressures. Russia will ultimately be victorious. And Putin's entire government echoes those statements. This is a far cry different from what Lukashenko is currently messaging to his own people. And so it doesn't seem like he's actually preparing his country for war. Now, could it still be the opposite? Could Lukashenko just be really bad at this war thing? Yes, that is a possibility, but remember, this man is very close to Vladimir Putin, and earlier in the war, he made strong statements that echoed Vladimir Putin's statements. He certainly knows how to message for a war if that's what he wanted to do. It doesn't seem to be what he is actually messaging. So from there, we can then look at the broader context, and that's where it gets even more interesting. Lukashenko is actually currently hedging his bets and trying to build more international partnerships with other big countries, in particular the United States. And this is something that he has actually not ever felt compelled to do. Belarus has always been a heavily sanctioned country, or at least it has been for a very long time. But Lukashenko felt very comfortable with that because he basically just integrated Belarus's economy with the Russian economy. And because Russia wanted to buy Belarus's loyalty, effectively, Belarus, or at least Lukashenko and his inner circle, were treated really well, better than they would be with an open economy with the outside world. Russia would build all sorts of infrastructure, they would provide all sorts of luxuries for Lukashenko, a really good deal. Who cares about the outside world? Now, as Russia gets weaker and weaker and weaker, we see Lukashenko releasing political prisoners in exchange, for example, for sanctions relief from the United States. Again, is that a full story in and of itself? No, it's not. Are there multiple ways to potentially interpret that? Yes, there are. Lukashenko could be doing this as a way to actually smuggle things into Russia through sanctions relief on Belarus. But there is a way to interpret this that is consistent with everything else in Lukashenko's own statements, that Belarus is actually afraid that Russia could lose the war. There is another strong indicator. But even more than that, we can look at Lukashenko's own behavior earlier in the war and contrast it with what's happening now. Because earlier in the war, Russia actually tried to drag Belarus into fighting against Ukraine. There were a lot of famous episodes here. There were actually Russians who attacked Ukrainian positions with Belarus's flags to try to convince the Ukrainians that Belarus was part of the war. And vice versa, there was evidence of false flag attacks on Belarus's territory made to look like Ukrainians that was later proven to be Russian soldiers. Russia trying to make both sides think that they're already fighting against each other to try to actually drag them into the war. At that time, pretty much everybody thought Russia was still going to win, even Ukraine's allies. So Lukashenko himself, if he wanted to join the war and gain glory and rewards for himself, he would have done so at that time. Now that Russia is getting hurt more than ever before, it simply doesn't make sense that Lukashenko would, at this point, now enter the war in a desperate Hail Mary, hoping to help Russia win. Again, it might make sense from an ally perspective if you have a Western mindset and you think we need to do whatever we can to help our allies win. But Lukashenko doesn't have a Western mindset. Lukashenko is a dictator. He is looking out for his own good above all else. His own power, how does he stay in power so that he can maintain the luxury that he's built up through years of repression? There's also more to this story, and that is the desires of the people of Belarus in contrast to the desires of Lukashenko, their dictator, which may be exactly why Belarus never entered this war in the first place. And it would explain exactly why Lukashenko is militarizing right now. You have to remember that Lukashenko is not a popular leader in Belarus. He actually lost the last election, and his own people largely view him as illegitimate. Now, do they hate him enough to risk their own lives and their own freedom to overthrow him? Clearly not, because it hasn't happened, at least not yet. But that acquiescence is a far cry different from these same people being willing to obey Lukashenko's commands if he tells them to go to war and risk their lives. Doing that presents a simple calculus to people. My leader is telling me to die. That's my choice either way. Maybe I will choose to take that risk for something that I want instead of the goals of my leader. And maybe I will actually turn around and rebel against my leader if that's my only option. This could very well be why Vladimir Putin eventually acquiesced and did not force Lukashenko to send his military into Ukraine. Perhaps he himself was convinced that the people of Belarus wouldn't handle this, and that it would create a big crisis for Belarus and for Russia, and Russia needed Belarus to be stable throughout the war. It is a very good explanation, and there's very good reason to believe this would happen. Because the people of Belarus, not only do they not like Lukashenko, but they also don't like the war in Ukraine. Generally speaking, the people of Belarus view Ukraine as a sister country, not one they're willing to fight against. They have a lot of close family ties that Lukashenko himself has pleaded to and referred to many times, where their families are buried in graveyards across the border, things of that sort. The people of Belarus, actually it's a fact that there have been more people from Belarus who have fought on the side of Ukraine than there have been who have fought on the side of Russia. Now that's illegal for them, but they've still done it by defecting to Ukrainian territory and joining units there, perhaps seeing this as an actual opportunity to fight for their freedom that isn't just hopeless. They can join some organized resistance in the form of the Ukrainian military. And the presence of Belarusian people in the Ukrainian military would be a very good reason for Lukashenko to be paranoid and worried about what might happen to him if Russia, his protector, lost the war. This is a huge, huge deal. And a lot of people in the West really don't understand all of this. They view Lukashenko as if he is Belarus, but he's not Belarus. He is the leader who is tolerated by the people of Belarus, but not the leader who actually commands them. And there is a massive, massive difference between the two. In this situation, as Lukashenko looks at Russia potentially losing, he has all the reason to militarize his country for several reasons. There is, of course, his own personal protection. There's also the fact that militaries have often been the favorite vehicle of dictators to radicalize the people. When you have, for example, mandatory military service, people become nationalistic and patriotic because they have kind of a brainwashing campaign, especially in countries run by dictators, about why their country is the best and why all the outsiders are evil. So there are a lot of reasons why Lukashenko would build up his military, and very few of them point to him actually preparing to attack Ukraine. If anything, it is more likely, in my opinion, that he is preparing to be attacked by Ukraine. Not because that's a realistic option, not because Ukraine has any desire to actually do that, but because he is a dictator, and dictators are paranoid people. Once again, this is the theory that is the most consistent with the broadest set of all of the available evidence. Now, that doesn't mean it's 100% correct and there's no possibility for blind spots. It doesn't mean Ukraine should just let their guard down and not be prepared if Belarus is truly preparing to attack them. But that is not the most likely scenario, and it's not something that people should be whipped up into a panic about. It's just something that they should be prepared for. But in reality, it seems like we're going towards a different outcome, one that is much, much worse for Russia. So if you appreciated this perspective and you want more like it, I want to ask you for a quick favor. Would you please like this video and subscribe to this channel? Because if you do that, YouTube will serve you more content just like this. And would you also consider becoming a YouTube channel member or a patron to support my work and the job that I do here on this YouTube channel, where I provide content for free for all of you. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.